So we'll just get started at this point. So we'll just let people sort of answer this poll while we're getting going. So I just wanted to introduce Joan Deely from the Land Stewardship Trust, who will be running this invasive workshop on our behalf. I wanted to introduce myself. I'm Amy Tarlow Lewis, and I'm the program coordinator here at the Middlesex Conservation District. And I want to introduce Susan Thomas, who's the district administrator.
Hello, everyone.
Nice.
Welcome.
Yeah. And so the way the workshop will run is that Joan will start the workshop, and then when she feels there's an appropriate place, she'll stop, and then we'll take several minutes to answer questions, and then she'll sort of cue us to move on so that when people have questions, we don't have to go all the way back to the beginning and sort of refresh people's memory. Sue, do you just want to take a moment and talk about the Conservation District?
Sure. So the Middlesex Conservation District serves Middlesex County. Districts were established back after the Dust Bowl in an effort to protect soil and water at the county level and provide local people with an opportunity to provide insights into their local resource issues to higher up levels of government, and also for resources from state and federal governments to filter back down to the local level. So at the Middlesex Conservation District, what we're trying to do is connect with as many people in the county as we can. We're a very diverse county with a wide variety of resource issues and types of landowners. And so we're here to listen and try to assist you with any of your concerns. One of the things we do is provide workshops like tonight's workshop. We've done one a month with the start of 2021. We're hoping to add a few more before summer gets too warm, and possibly start up again with a couple in the fall. This Zoom format has been very successful for us, but we also hope to do some small in-person, socially distanced, outdoor types of tour and small group programs as well. And we're supported both by grants at the state level, but also through our plant sale, which is going on now. We sell largely native plants, and right now it's more tree seedlings, perennials, edibles. So I'd encourage you to check that out. If you're looking to replace your invasives with natives, we have all different kinds of plants, from low story forest plants to shrubs to flowers that you might put in your meadow. And finally, we pursue pilot projects to see if new approaches in the county might pan out as something that we can spread both statewide or even further. And right now, we're working on a project looking at manure composting in the state, in the county, to better understand how, if manure is being composted or provided back to the soil in the way that would be ideal, or if there are possibly pollution issues with that we might need to address, or build partnerships with people to preserve the soil quality and the carbon sequestration in the county. So that's sort of a little bit about us. We're eager to learn about you, and we're glad to see so many of you here tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we'll get started with the presentation. So Joan, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and let you put up your slide.
Okay, fingers crossed. Is it, we there?
I don't see it just yet.
Yep.
There we go. You're all set.
Okay. Okay. My name is Joan Deely. I work for Land Stewardship Incorporated. We do invasive plant control and habitat restoration. Have been in business for over 15 years. And we are located in Gill, Mass, which is near Greenfield, in case you don't know where Gill is. Many people don't. So we're going to talk about invasive plants. I'm going to cover some history, some identification, and some management concepts. So hopefully the first slide will come along as I wanted it to. There we go. I wanted to start by defining some terms and providing some context for our understanding of invasive plants. Native plant species are ones that have been, the general definition is that they're plants that have been in our region since the time of colonization. Some native plant species that you might be familiar with are blueberries, trout lilies, sugar maples, and cranberries. Exotic or alien species are plants that have been brought into our region from away, but are not behaving in an invasive manner and have sort of become part of our general plant community. We might not love dandelions, but they're not technically invasive plants. Invasive plant species, however, are ones that have been imported in a variety of ways from away, usually other continents, into our area. And because of growth habits that they have, and because they're released from their native predators, they begin to exhibit invasive qualities. The Massachusetts Invasive Plant Advisory Group, or MIPAG, is a group of folks from academia, from some municipal places, nonprofits, and the horticultural industry, who have been meeting for a number of years to define the issue of native plants and to establish plants in the Commonwealth that are invasive, potentially invasive, or not invasive. And they have helped to develop contribute to the state plant list. And this is the definition that we use when we're trying to establish what an invasive plant means. It's important to note that variety, subspecies, and cultivars are included in this definition because they often return to type once they've grown out a couple generations, then they are no longer sterile as perhaps advertised. So I wanted to explore the concept of ecosystem services. Ecosystem services are most beneficially expressed by a functional ecosystem, one that has an intact community of plants and animals in our area. They provide services to us that really are hard to quantify and hard to qualify because they're not things that we're actually paying for, but they're services that are very essential to the life of everybody on the planet. Ecosystem services include provisioning, which is the services that products that we obtain from our ecosystems, like food, fresh water, fibers of different types, fuel, genetic resources, biochemicals, and pharmaceuticals and natural medicines, and also ornamental resources. Regulating services would cover things like the regulation of air quality and climate, timing extensive flooding, and waste treatment, disease regulation, natural pest control, pollution and erosion control, and coastal storm protection. Supporting services are sort of overarching, less clearly defined services that our environment provides for us, and they occur on a larger temporal scale, but they're obviously necessary for maintaining the other services. They include things like photosynthesis, primary production, nutrient and water cycling, soil formation, and maintenance of soil fertility. And then finally, we discuss the concept of cultural services, which are non-material benefits that we get from a functional ecosystem, and they include aesthetic values, recreation and tourism, and cultural heritage values. All these processes work together to make ecosystems sustainable, functional, and resilient to change, and they also provide us with an actual living. When a potentially invasive plant or animal species is transported out of its native habitat in, say, Japan, and finds itself in, for instance, Groton, it will find itself growing without the checks and balances of its native predators. It will find itself free of its native bacteria, fungi, insects, and animals that might keep the plant in check. So that's part of what contributes to make a plant becoming an invasive and jeopardizing ecosystem service concept. Another big issue with invasive plant infestations is the effect that they have on biodiversity. I'm using the example of Japanese knotweed here to make this point. in the late summer when knotweed blooms, it's covered with flowers and often covered with bees and other pollinators. And people often remark on how it's obviously serving a good purpose for pollinator species. But the downside to an infestation or a large infestation of something like Japanese knotweed is that no other plants are growing underneath it because it creates such a dense cover. So the seasonal flow of pollinator species that would go from spring through summer and fall of our native species is not present. So the pollinators are deprived of sort of a sequence of food sources that they don't have access to because of the knotweed there. Another aspect of intensive invasive occupation of an area has to do with the trophic level of food up through the food chain. The invasive plants are not passing up the energy that they derive from sun in a way that benefits plants and animals up the food chain. In the case of the caterpillar there on the left, the right, it has a very specific relationship with a particular tree. It needs a certain kind of a leaf to feed on. And then that caterpillar provides sustenance for songbirds, which then provide food for hawks and owls. If those trees that caterpillar needs are not present, it won't succeed. And therefore, the next level up of things that it would feed is also not succeeding. As to illustrate this point, the native black walnut trees, for instance, can support over 100 different species of animals. Sugar maple trees can support over 250. And white oak trees can support over 500 species of butterflies and caterpillars, according to Doug Tallamy. The invasive plants that would be impeding those plants' life cycle and preventing them from regenerating support anywhere from 0 to 7 plant insect species, which is not going to benefit the creatures that depend on those insect species. One further example is that a pair of chickadees requires between 6,000 and 9,000 insects to successfully raise a clutch of chicks. And if those insects aren't available, they don't have a successful nest, and we start to lose bird populations. Whoops, I'm so sorry. I don't know what I did. I did it again. There we go. So the main source of invasive plants in our landscape, unfortunately, are plants that have escaped from horticultural use. This is not to impugn the horticultural industry, nor to impugn people who garden, but we value ornamental traits in the plants that we like to grow. We like them to be hardy. We like them to be carefree, have showing abundant flowers. We like them especially to be disease and pest resistant. Unfortunately, these are the very characteristics that tend to be exhibited by plants that behave in an invasive manner. They're habitat generalists. They can grow in sunny conditions, shade, dry, wet. They often colonize disturbed areas that other plants are not going to grow in. Excuse me, they produce an abundant quantity of seeds, and they are also, very importantly, they're not affected by native pests and diseases, so they have that gives them a competitive advantage over the natives. To show an example of how our demand for interesting horticultural plants drives invasives, this is sapphire berry, which is a plant that is described in very glowing terms by this nursery that's growing it in Connecticut. Notice that one of the features of it is that it's low maintenance and it attracts birds and wildlife. It's in high demand, but hardly ever available. Unfortunately, we have recently been contracted with a town in the eastern part of the state that has found the sapphire berry plants have begun to spread into a town forest that they're trying to manage. And they are very concerned about the impact that this plant's having on their, excuse me, on their town forest. A famous example of a plant that was propagated and promoted because people thought it was really interesting and unusual was Japanese knotweed. It was brought into the United Kingdom in 1850 as a specimen plant. It became very popular very quickly. People were very taken by the shape of it and the leaves. It's kind of exotic looking. It had a lot of flowers. But by the beginning of the 1900s, it was beginning to be noted that it was having some unpleasant side effects on the landscape. At this point in the UK now, Japanese knotweed occurs all throughout it at varying densities, but it's become quite an expensive problem. Eradicating it's not possible, but if you could eradicate it, it's estimated to cost 56 billion pounds. It's also been granted legal status. It's illegal to spread knotweed. And it also, excuse me, affects people's ability to sell real estate. If you have to certify in certain areas that you don't have knotweed on your property. And if you do, there's a very elaborate and expensive remediation process that must be undertaken. My final example of an introduced plant that was brought here with good intentions but went pretty much rogue is kudzu. It is often described in rather dramatic and perhaps overblown terms like terrorist wildfire, but nevertheless, it has become a major problem in the South. It was originally introduced in this country at the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia and didn't spark a huge lot of interest at first, but by the time the Dust Bowl rolled around, the Soil Conservation Service felt that kudzu might be a useful plant for preventing erosion of topsoil. And they raised millions and millions, literally, of seedlings and distributed them to farmers and even included a cost incentive for farmers to plant it. At this point in the South, it tends not to grow in interiors very much. It's often a plant of edge settings like along roadsides or field edges, but it still is a very damaging plant. It's the horse is out of the barn with that one, I think. We also tend to, we introduce other species into areas that, and get into trouble doing that, often with the best of intentions. This is a cane toad. It was introduced to Australia to control sugarcane grubs. It's a venomous frog. It's about the size, mature cane toads are about the size of a dinner plate, and they'll eat anything its size, a little bigger and everything smaller than it. As it turns out, the biology of the cane toad and the biology of the sugarcane grub don't intersect. So this frog would never have actually been able to control the grubs because they don't ever cross paths, so to speak. And now in certain parts of Australia, cane toad infestations are pretty epic. This is Iceland, where the lupin was introduced to control erosion and to cover bare ground. Because there's such an active volcanic activity in Iceland, there's often large swaths of ground that need to be recolonized. As you can see in this picture, the lupin has really taken off. It's quite lovely to see this vast field of purple, but to other folks who look at it, they see a real threat to plant diversity in Iceland. And then my final example is the introduction of moose to Newfoundland in the early 1900s to provide protein to Newfoundlanders who were facing decreased takes in fisheries. It took a couple of tries to get the moose established, but they have become established, and they're now a really significant safety risk to people driving in Newfoundland. There's quite a high fatality rate in moose crashes, but they're also competing successfully with native caribou because they're competing for food sources. So we've brought something from away, again, often with good intentions, but things go off the rails pretty quickly. Some other factors that contribute to the spread of invasive plants is climate change. Because climate change is having such unpredictable impacts on rainfall and drought, etc. Invasives are favored to grow, to be adaptable to climate change effects because they're generalist species. They can tolerate these different ranges of dryness and heavy rainfall and warming and cooling temperatures that other native plants aren't as quick to adapt to. And also, as the climate warms, plants that are currently invasive, functioning in an invasive manner in mid-Atlantic and southern states are likely to start moving northward. This is a hardiness zone map that shows the change in hardiness zones over a fairly short period of time, but gives you an idea of how the temperature shifts are moving along apace. And finally, this very heavy precipitation map shows how the greater Northeast has experienced a really dramatic increase in these very heavy precipitation events that are often interspersed with periods of drought. So we get really heavy downfalls that might be following a period of drought, and there's a lot of increased erosion and sedimentation in streams and rivers. Amy, I can take a break here. Oh wait, no, I can't. I have one more thing to say. In terms of managing our landscapes, we also have to consider deer and the impact that they have on both functional ecosystems and also restoration efforts. This picture illustrates the difference in vegetative cover between a deer exclosure, which is to the left of the fence, and an area where the deer are not excluded from. The deer tend to preferentially graze on native plants. So they are preventing forest regeneration in this case. A lot of what you see on the right is hay-scented fern, which can end up growing into a pretty uniform understory in a forest system that can then also suppress forest regeneration, even though the hay-scented fern is not technically an invasive species. In some areas in the country, deer populations the deer pressure per acre is really intense and can really damage both an unmanaged area like a conservation area, and it can also really impede restoration efforts unless you take steps to protect the plants you're restoring with. And finally, this photograph here is from Mattituck on Long Island, in an area that has very heavy deer pressure and a lot of invasive plant pressure as well, because a lot of it is, I think partly because a lot of it used to be in agriculture and it's been let go. So what you're seeing in the top picture is an overstory of all Norway maple. The plants in the front are the last year's stems from garlic mustard, and there's next to no regeneration going on in the floor of this area. You can also see bittersweet vines in that picture. The picture on the bottom shows what is left of Atlantic white cedars that were growing in the area that have been basically overwhelmed by bittersweet and have died. And again, the overstory there is all Norway maples. Now I can take a break.
Fantastic. So if anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat and then I can feed them to Joan. So we'll just take a minute. So we're waiting for some questions to come in. So I have a question. So in the town that I live in, we have a couple of pretty significant size farms. And I know deer are definitely a concern for the for-profit farms, especially with the deer. Is there any recommendations you have for farmers to help manage their invasive species to potentially like keep out the deer, or the deer just sort of just like mow everything down?
And unfortunately, a lot of what one needs to do to manage deer is deer fencing, which can be very expensive, especially if you're trying to fence off a large property. Some folks, I think, have experimented with planting sort of vegetative buffers around fields. So with the idea that the plants that are installed along the edge of the fields the deer will browse on those and not go into the area where you're trying to grow your desired crops. Mm-hmm. The case has also been made that in part, and this is only part of the overpopulation of deer, is a decline in hunting. In part because the hunting community is graying and a lot of people aren't taking up hunting as young people. Hunting is not necessarily going to solve the problem of overpopulation of deer. So I mean, in some places they're talking about reintroducing wolves, but I don't think that's going to happen in Littleton.
Yeah, I know we have a bobcat because I've seen it in my yard a couple of times. And I know there's a property here in Littleton that allows for seasonal bow hunting. So we do have one question, and it's from Greg, and says, do you have a list with pictures of the most common invasive species in our area?
Well, I do, as a matter of fact, that's the next part.
Excellent.
But I can't, at the end of this slideshow, I do have a list of resources that I can leave up for folks.
Okay. And Greg can get a hold of me and I can connect the two of you.
Yep.
So, and then another question has come in. Sorry, I'm just going to scroll back up. Okay, so she's wondering if you can at some point talk about strategies for containing and eliminating plants like sumac, bittersweet, and Japanese knotweed. We are regenerating a clear-cut area which is dominated along its edges with these plants.
I'll get to management strategies a little later on, not to deflect the question, but I think we'll get there.
Okay, great. So there's no other questions that have come in, so let's just move on to your next section.
Okay, this is the ID section where we'll, when I spoke with Amy earlier, she had several plants that seemed to be of particular interest to folks in this area, so that I'm going to feature those. I'm not going to go through the whole list of every invasive plant on the planet. But let's start with honeysuckle. There are a number of bush honeysuckles. This is Morrow's honeysuckle. The honeysuckle, like many invasive plants, leaves out very early in the spring. You can see in the bottom right-hand photo the uniform understory of honeysuckle that has already leafed out before our native plants have. So again, it's a competitive advantage that the invasives have, that inhibits the regeneration or just the blossoming of our native plants. Honeysuckle are most easily identified by their flowers. Otherwise, I find them very difficult to tell apart in the field because there are a number of them. But a key identifying factor for honeysuckle is a hollow stem. So if you're looking at a woody shrub and you're not sure if it's honeysuckle or not, you can snap off a branch and you can find a hollow stem and you know that you have an invasive honeysuckle species. Excuse me. I include this picture just because sometimes a very mature honeysuckle is a little hard to distinguish from a high bush blueberry. A mature one, the high bush blueberry tends to have much shreddier bark than the honeysuckle does. There's also an invasive vining honeysuckle called Japanese honeysuckle. Unlike the other bush honeysuckles, it has dark, almost black berries. It does vine up trees and will impede the tree's growth, and the leaves do persist into the fall as these kind of maroony guys, and they are opposite leaves. There is a native honeysuckle in our area called fly honeysuckle, and as you can see, the flowers are quite different from the invasive honeysuckles. They're pendulous yellow blossoms, and the stem of the fly honeysuckle is not hollow if you have a question about what you're looking at. And there's also a native vine honeysuckle that is very attractive to pollinator species, in particular to sphinx moths and hummingbirds. Next, let's take up the cause of multiflora rose. When it blooms in the spring, it's very fragrant. It fills the air with a wonderful scent. And in the fall, they have persistent, lovely little rose hips that people often use for winter decorations. I'm sorry to report that in the 50s, the Soil Conservation Service was promoting multiflora rose as a living hedge and was guiding farmers on how to plant multiflora rose to replace fencing. And we have then, since then, obviously it's gone to escape and become a big problem. It's often seen in pasture settings like the one on the upper left. Multiflora rose will climb. It's not a vine, but it will grow up another tree or something, almost like it's growing up a trellis. The picture I include on the lower left is what remained after some very large multiflora rose bushes were removed from this site, and what came up the next growing season was dozens and dozens and dozens of seedlings from the seed bank that was left behind after the plant was removed. The major plant was removed. In this case of this job, we treated these seedlings with propane torches because we were abutting some conservation land that had some restrictions on the practices we could use. And that seemed to be a pretty effective way to control them, although they will keep reappearing for several years because there's so much, there's such a large number of seeds in the soil. Whoops, I did it again. There are a few native roses. In particular, I'm featuring here swamp rose. One of the main distinguishing features of multiflora rose is that the stipule is fringed, as depicted in the upper left picture. Swamp rose's stipule is winged. The multiflora rose has this really intense thorn that can rip whatever, rips your clothes, rips your skin. I'm sure if you've walked through any place that has multiflora rose, you've suffered some damage. And the swamp rose has a very polite and sweet little thorn on it. I include these pictures just because it's still wintertime in a way here. In the winter, the multiflora rose stems maintain a greenish cast, and they also, their little rose hips persist. The swamp rose's stems are more of a rust color, and their rose hips are much bigger than in comparison to the multiflora rose. So if you're out and about, those are some interesting field identification signs that you can use to see if you are looking at one or the other. There is, coming into our area is something called rosette disease. This is a disease that was first discovered in the Rocky Mountain area in the 40s, and it is gradually working its way into our area. Unfortunately, it affects all roses, not just multiflora rose. It can be I believe it's a mite that introduces a virus of some sort that can be spread by wind, clothing, tools being transported around. I have seen the effect of rosette disease at a conservation area in Northampton that completely killed really large multiflora rose bushes. They were just skeletons, and it had only taken a couple of growing seasons for that to take effect. So that's kind of a good news, bad news story, actually. Our next woody species is autumn olive, which is another plant that has escaped from cultivation, and it was also in the 80s promoted by the Soil Conservation Service as a source of food for birds. I certainly bought some dutifully and planted them in my yard, and then took them out 10 years later. But multiflora, all the autumn olive tends to have a silvery green leaves. They have these lovely little blossoms that also fill the air with perfume in the spring. They produce a prodigious amount of seed. Of berries. The berries are harvested by some folks to make fruit leathers or pies. They're very tart, but they have very high levels of lycopene, and they're, I guess, very good for us. Harvesting them can be a little tricky though, because the plants have these little thorns on them. Because of their silvery green leaves, they are pretty easy to pick out in the landscape. Once you develop a sort of a mind picture of what they look like, they sort of stand out like a sore thumb or a sore invasive. And now we're going to move into some vining invasives. Oriental bittersweet or Asiatic bittersweet is a very aggressive vine, again introduced as a horticultural species for its pretty berries. People still tend to use it for fall decorations because they are very pretty. Unfortunately, they also spread like crazy. The picture in the upper left here, similar to the picture that I showed earlier about the multiflora rose plant, this is what was left under a large vining, very heavily fruited bittersweet plants were removed. There's a lot of seed in the seed bank, and the next growing season, all the little seedlings started popping up, and they will need to be managed perhaps by propane torches again. But that site would need to be monitored for a number of years as the seed bank begins to hopefully exhaust itself. This picture I include to show how late into the fall season invasives will maintain green leaves. This little seedling of bittersweet was found in December when someone was doing some garden cleanup. It was growing under these plants that had gone by, and when they were moved aside, there it was happily growing along, and pretty late in the growing, well, after the growing season. Bittersweet, as we know, can strangle and kill trees, sometimes by twisting around them and cutting off the cambium so that they can't supply themselves with nutrients, but more likely because they outcompete with the plant for light and so forth. And then actually the vine becomes heavy enough that it can pull down an already weakened tree. Under the vines, you will also tend to find mats of bittersweet that are also going to be suppressing regeneration because they're so dense, and they're also looking for an opportunity to climb something. There is a native bittersweet, American bittersweet, that has a different and less aggressive growth pattern than the Asiatic or Oriental bittersweet, and a different arrangement of flowers and fruits. It has been hybridizing with the Asiatic or Oriental bittersweet, though, so it's beginning to get increasingly difficult to tell which species you have that you're looking at. Another vining problem plant that is becoming more common, and maybe because I know it more or because it's occurring more, I'm not sure which, is porcelainberry. Another plant that was popular as a horticultural species because of the pretty berries. Unfortunately, it also has the vining tendencies similar to bittersweet in that it will climb up and smother trees. The berries are very pretty. They have an array of different colors throughout the growing season. But part of the competitive strategy of invasives is that they can, like porcelainberry or glossy blackthorn, they can flower and produce fruit throughout the growing season, unlike, for instance, grape, which has just one crop of fruit per year. Porcelainberry and grape can be confusing for me or for other people, well, I'm sure, because the leaves look somewhat similar and they both have tendrils. But obviously the mature fruit of grape and mature fruit of porcelainberry is very different. The flowers of grape grow in branched clusters, while the flowers of porcelainberry are flat or round-topped inflorescence. Again, if you see them side by side, it's a lot easier to tell them apart. A vining plant that is not a woody plant like the previous ones, but that is also a problem and a growing problem in Massachusetts is mile-a-minute vine. It has very distinctive triangular shaped leaves and some recurved little thorn, or not thorns, but little prickers along the stems, and this little fruiting body that at the end of the stems. It has the habit of overrunning an area and draping itself across the landscape, again inhibiting any kind of regeneration. The vines persist into the winter, draping themselves over everything. The good news is that there is a biocontrol for mile-a-minute vine that has been released in different areas. It has to be released by hand, which does inhibit the use of it in remote infestations of mile-a-minute vine. But I've came across an article recently that talked about some folks at West Virginia University who have used a combination of drones and 3D printing to distribute weevils, these mile-a-minute weevils, into remote infestations of mile-a-minute vine. They use the drones to map areas. They ground truthed them before they decided that the drone was giving accurate information. And then they made biodegradable pods with a 3D printer, filled them with mile-a-minute weevils, connected them to the drones, and shipped them out to these infestations of mile-a-minute vine. And that's how big they are. They're little tiny dots, but they do their job. I'm including pale swallowwort here. It's not it's a vining plant that doesn't have the same kind of habit as the previous vining plants, but it does create a very dense tangle of vines that are, maybe they don't get much more than maybe 4 or 5 feet tall. but they become very densely entangled with each other. One of its common names is dog strangle vine, because it hopefully isn't strangling dogs, but when you try to walk through it, it's a very dense interwoven collection of vines. It is a member of the milkweed family, and it reproduces in a manner similar to milkweed with pods that release fluffy little seed-carrying devices in the fall. It's also, as a member of the milkweed family, it can be a problematic plant for monarch butterflies. If they lay their eggs on this plant, the larvae are not able to feed on these leaves and they die. So it can be an infestation of it can be a problem for the success of monarch butterflies in an area. These are just some pictures of swallowwort as it's growing as a uniform understory in a forest, is a vining mess in a pasture, and the pods do persist throughout the winter once they've released their seeds. I'm including the picture on the bottom right to help us understand how difficult it is to hand pull swallowwort, because the stem, the red line indicates the level of the soil. And so if you pull the stem, you might break it off, but you're not going to get the roots, because the stem then goes down deeper into the ground before it enters into the rooting part of the plant, and it makes it very difficult to successfully get a swallowwort plant out unless you're digging with mattock or something. I have, again, a reason why I included swallowwort is I have seen folks who are trying to raise hay for horses and have had to abandon their hay raising operations because their fields have become contaminated with swallowwort, and it's not really palatable to horses or other livestock, for one thing, and also if you're baling it into hay, you're going to spread it. Now, when I spoke with Amy about some plants that people in your area were interested in, she brought up Horiolisum as a plant that people who are raising or growing hay, particularly for use for horses, but also for livestock in general, that Horiolisum is starting to turn up in people's pastures. I'm not that familiar with this plant. It tends to be more common in the out west, but apparently is beginning to appear in our pasture areas and hay fields, in part probably because it might have come in with hay that people might have brought in from the west. It's not really clear how it got here.
Yeah, we have, and Sue, maybe you can join in. We have some people who have horses in, is it Bolton, Sue, that are having a Boxborough that are having this issue. And it might be contained just to the town of Boxborough. It might not have spread to surrounding towns, but it's definitely an issue that the town of Boxborough seems to be having. So we definitely wanted to make sure for people in our area who have horses that it was issue, and it's making the horses sick for sure.
Yeah, that's correct. And I'm not aware of it being outside of Boxborough at this time, but we were concerned that when it's in our area, it doesn't take long for these plants to spread. So we wanted to make sure we covered it so people could identify it if they find it in their yards or on their lands, and know that it's a concern, particularly for horses, but in general for the native environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
From what I've come to understand about this plant, one of the best ways to control it is through pasture management practices, sound pasture management practices of rotational grazing, perhaps, or nutrient improvement to the soil. Mowing can work, but it would have to be done before the plants go to seed. It would have to be done repeatedly, which is hard to do when you're trying to, you harvest the hay just a few times a year. It's not to your benefit to keep cutting it over and over again. It also can spread, as is illustrated by this picture here, by attaching itself to our clothes. So it's if you're in an area that has a plant like this in it, it's very important to clean your clothing and your shoes after you've been in that area. Mm-hmm. And the other plant, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If you were to go back to the previous slide that you had of the Horiolisum, so that almost looks like the photograph on the upper left corner. It almost looks like sage or lamb's ear.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I don't know if I wouldn't be able to identify it.
I think
Something other
the
than-
flowers are probably more easily identifiable feature, but then once it starts to flower, it's close to setting seed, which is worrisome. The other plant that Amy had asked me to address is Donny Brome. This is also a plant species that is much more common out west in rangeland. The problem with this plant is that it has the seed heads of it, I think, have little, they irritate the mouths and the digestive tract of the animals that eat them. And I guess this horses are particularly susceptible to this problem. I don't think it's inherently fatal, but it can be a problem that requires veterinarian intervention for the horses. So it's something to keep an eye on. Again, I don't know where in your area this is turning up, but it is apparently becoming a problem, or possibly could be a problem.
Parts of it in Groton.
In
So,
Groton?
yeah.
I include this little link because I found some very interesting information at this site. It's an extension site from the University of Nebraska, where they obviously are doing a lot of rangeland work. But it would be a good resource for people if they wanted to know more about this plant and how to manage it if they happen to find it in their fields. I think that this is another break point.
Great. So we'll just give everyone a minute, and if anyone has any questions that they want to filter in. So just going back a little bit, are there any native honeysuckle plants, or are they all invasive?
There's the fly honeysuckle is a shrub that is I have seen in our region, in our area. It's easiest to identify when it's flowering. It has those pretty little droopy yellow flowers. And then there's the vine, the honeysuckle vine that has those coral colored flowers. That plant is sold pretty widely at any nursery that is offering native plant species. I know they have it at Garden of the Woods or Nasami Farms, but it's also available, I think, at other nurseries because it's becoming more popular because it's such a hit with hummingbirds.
So another question is, let me just scroll back up. So Oriental bittersweet and American bittersweet, they're sort of very similar in appearance. Can you help us differentiate how we can tell them apart?
The American bittersweet has flowers at the end of the stems, and the fruiting bodies are clustered at the end of the stems. The Oriental bittersweet has flowers along the stem and consequently berries along the stem. They're unfortunately very similar in other ways. I have only seen American bittersweet once, and it was in a wildflower garden that someone had planted it intentionally. I've never seen it in the wild, so to speak.
And then, and I think you might get to this later in your presentation, but there's a question about containing and eliminating plants like sumac, bittersweet, and Japanese knotweed. I know there are chemical methods of doing it and non-chemical methods of doing it, and I don't know if that's something you're going to address later on.
I could take a second to address that person's questions right now. They have a problem with sumac.
I'm assuming from the question, yes.
Sumac, knotweed, and what was the third one?
Sumac, bittersweet, and Japanese knotweed.
Well, the short answer is that there are mechanical and manual methods to control all of those plants. They require a very serious commitment on the part of the landowner to try to make them successful. And depending on the size of the infestations, there are times when you do have to start the control effort with herbicides before you switch to other methods. Knotweed in particular is one of I think knotweed and Phragmites are probably the two most difficult plants that we have encountered in our work. They're the most difficult to manage and just really hard to get a handle on. People with knotweed, I know people have tried smothering it. They've tried putting cardboard on it. They've tried all manner of different ways to try to defeat the plant, and it just it grows down. It can grow down as deep as 6 feet, and it can grow laterally as far as 70 feet away from a plant, a stem of knotweed. So it has a very aggressive rhizome system that is very difficult to remove completely, and it also will grow from broken fragments of the rhizome. So if you're trying to dig it out, you might end up doing more damage than you're doing good, unfortunately. Sumac I'm not that familiar with because it's a native plant, and I know some people would like it to not be where it's growing, but I don't really have any experience with how to manage sumac. And bittersweet, I do discuss that in a little bit, but when we manage bittersweet, we use a combination of cut stem treatments and some hand pulling of smaller plants, and then foliar treatment of the really dense mats in order to get an upper hand on the invasives.
Mhm.
I know people have a lot of concerns about herbicide use, but sometimes it has to be part of the toolbox.
Yeah, absolutely.
Shall I proceed?
There's one more question that came in.
Yep.
Can sumac be a sumac confused with, and I'm gonna not pronounce this correctly, alienithus?
Alanthus?
Yes.
It could be because they have similar compound leaves, but sumac, the stems are fuzzy especially on the younger plants, and Alanthus has a very distinctive smell, kind of like cat pee. So if you crush the leaves or break the branches off and take a sniff, you can tell that you're dealing with Alanthus and not sumac. And Alanthus also grows a lot taller than sumac does.
Okay, great. So that's all the questions that have filtered in at this point.
Okay. I will move on to management approaches. We have two choices here. One choice is passive management, which is doing nothing and letting nature manage itself, and accepting that we're faced with the development of novel ecosystems, which would be a plant community made up of invasives. If thinking to my earlier point about biodiversity and food chain issues, a novel ecosystem is not going to support our native plants and animals, however. We can also choose active management to try to mitigate some of the impacts we've had on our natural systems. If you are going to engage in any kind of invasive plant work on your property or on any conservation land or whatever, it's important to check to see if you have wetlands on your on your property, because you will need to be in touch with your local conservation commission to find out what kind of permitting is going to be required. You can get a sense of wetlands on your land in question if you use Mass GIS, the Oliver system. You can look up your property and you can get a wetland layer. This is free and open to all, to get a sense of where your wetlands on your property might be. It's possible you may need to hire a wetland scientist to delineate the wetlands if there's if the Conservation Commission and the homeowner or the landowner agree that they need a more precise definition of the wetland, but this gives you a general idea of where wetlands are. You would also want to find out if your project area is within a rare and endangered species habitat polygon. This is also available on Mass GIS. If you find that you do have you are in an NHESP polygon, there's a process to go through with that agency to find out how to proceed. There may be seasonal restrictions on what you can do based on, say, the habits of what wood turtles or something, but that's another piece of the puzzle when you're launching a project. So the level 1 management methods includes all kinds of different manual methods: digging, sawing, mattocking, lopping, or using weed wrenches to get rid of invasives. These all are useful to some degree. They're obviously not going to be useful for a huge infestation on acres of land, but for smaller infestations or outlying invasives where you want to prevent them from spreading, these are perfectly useful tools. I encourage people to become familiar with what their target invasives look like as seedlings, because if you can jump on seedlings when they're at this stage, you're going to save an enormous amount of effort and money further down the road by doing some targeted hand pulling. Manual methods are a great way to involve volunteers, partners, and stakeholders in managing a piece of land that you're working on. It could be a piece of town property or some conservation land or land trust land. It's a great way to get people together to work on a project, just to help them figure out what plants they're looking for and what the boundaries of the area are that you want to work on. And then sometimes you can come up with some fun ways to encourage people or reward them for their efforts that might involve cookies or donuts or something. Hand pulling is a perfectly legitimate way to manage, especially seedlings. This fellow on the right is hand pulling Japanese stiltgrass that's occurring in a very limited area in order to keep it small. And the hand down at the bottom there is holding a bunch of glossy buckthorn seedlings. Mowing can also be a useful non-mechanical kind of way of controlling things. In this case, a huge section of multiflora rose has been mowed and removed from this area, and that bare ground is now able to be perhaps reseeded or have other plantings installed to replace the overstory of the rose. There has been some limited successful use of buckthorn baggies. They're basically heavy plastic black bags that are placed over a cut stem of a large buckthorn woody shrub, but it's of limited use because you obviously can't cover seedlings with this. And I'm not sure that it's been highly successful, but people have been fooling around with this as a strategy, part of the toolbox. And as I mentioned earlier, there's the propane torch concept. It's very effective on plants like multiflora rose and Japanese barberry that have a really nice sturdy crown that can be torched, and it's basically, the point is to superheat it, and then that kills the plant. We've also used it in limited applications on garlic mustard and Japanese stiltgrass. Obviously, this is a technique that requires some training, and you can't do it under certain conditions. You don't want to light the whole woods on fire. In the case of the stiltgrass project we worked on, the person using the torch was accompanied by someone with a water backpack to make sure that no fire spread beyond the area we were working in. For permitting considerations for level 1 work, it's not really some kind of work that requires permits in our experience, although it would be helpful to have a chat with your Conservation Commission to express what your intentions are and where you're working, and maybe have their input into developing your plan. And then you would want to have waivers of liability for volunteers to participate, and perhaps a meeting with the community members or neighbors of the subject property, so people know what's going on and why it's going on. Level 2 management would be applicable to more intensive infestations that require a different set of tools. This is where we start to segue into the judicious use of herbicides. This judicious use implies that you're integrating use of herbicides with other management techniques like hand pulling and mowing and so forth. As with any activity you undertake to manage invasives, timing is critically important. In terms of herbicide use, there are times of the year when a plant is more vulnerable to the effects of an herbicide. In terms of manual methods, you really would want to be hand pulling plants before they set seed, so that you minimize the risk of spreading the seeds further. And any time you hand pull, to go back a second, or produce any kind of woody debris from the work you're doing, it's very important that it's properly disposed of to prevent spread. Some plants like garlic mustard or stiltgrass or some other plants, herbaceous plants like that, are well disposed of by putting them in black plastic bags and baking them in the sun, and then disposing of them as trash, basically. This is a cut stem application, which is very effective it's a very effective targeted way of treating woody invasives and things like bittersweet. And in this case, an herbicide is placed directly on a freshly cut stem, and it has a marking die in it so you can keep track of where you have been working. It can be used throughout the year, even in the winter, except for the sap season that we have now. These bittersweet vines have been treated with a cut stem treatment. They were cut off right above the ground, like an inch or two above the ground, cut stem treated with an herbicide, and then cut again higher so that the people who are working on this project can see where they have been, what vines they've cut. The vines are then left in the trees because trying to extract them from the trees will damage the trees more than it's worth. They will eventually, they dry out pretty quickly once they've been cut. Part of what we do before we use herbicides is a prep cut, which helps to decrease the amount of leaf surface that needs to be treated further down the road when you're using herbicide. And it also challenges the plants by forcing them to produce another set of leaves and whatnot throughout the growing season. So you're already giving the plant a little bit of a run for its money. This person here is using a shield to do a very targeted foliar spot treatment. The picture on the right shows the condition of what's left after large glossy buckthorns were removed from this site. To this point, you're left with much smaller plants and a very decreased need for herbicide to be applied. Herbicide can also be applied very strategically by hand wiping, or by, in the case of knotweed, stem injection, which is a very extremely targeted way of getting herbicide into the rhizomes of the Japanese knotweed. Level 2 permitting and regulatory practices are much more involved than level 1. I always encourage people, if they're in a jurisdictional area or they think they might be, to talk to their conservation commission and find out what kind of filing protocol they would like them to follow. You may need to file a request for determination of applicability or a notice of intent, or and an ecological restoration limited project, depending on the size of the project. And then the person who's doing the application of the herbicide must be a licensed applicator. We post the signs that we're working on so people know what's going on and what the reentry interval is. The applicators have to wear appropriate PPE. Commissions require annual reporting in this case when when work is going on in a jurisdictional area. And coastal projects may require input from the Division of Marine Fisheries. Level 3 management applies to really vast places of invasion that are just a wreck. Sometimes we call these erase and start over projects because there are so many invasives and such a thorough suppression of regeneration that it's you're going to have to do restoration planting after the invasives are removed here. It requires a different level of application of herbicide. It also can involve Davco mowers, which in this case, this mower has chewed up all the woody invasives along the edge of this property, which is now open and ready to be reseeded or replanted. I think this was going to be reseeded for pasture. And then a really large scale mechanical method involves a brontosaurus, which is a big cutting head that's mounted on this very significant piece of equipment to knock down woody invasives before you start to do whatever your next phase of work is going to be. The pictures on the right show an area where a brontosaurus mowed all the woody invasives back there, and then the next growing season, there's much more access to light, and the conditions are more favorable for both native regeneration and for restoration planting. And level 3 permitting is, as you would imagine, if you're in a jurisdictional area, will also require conversation with the Conservation Commission and likely permitting. The treatment sequence that we employ in my company and have done perfected over a number of years is a 3-year program which begins with an initial treatment of prep cutting and a chemical application. We achieve 90% control with that method. The second year is follow-up, much less herbicide is needed at that point, and there can also be added in some manual work of hand pulling. Same in the third year, even less need for chemicals, more manual work of some sort, and then stewardship and maintenance work as the years go by to keep a site clean. Stewardship and maintenance is often something that can be useful for involving volunteers on a project, because people can have some investment in a piece of land that they've been working on and want to be able to keep an eye on it and keep it in good shape for the future. And this is a collection of resources on invasive plants. The item at the very bottom, mistaken identity, is a very helpful guide. It's not comprehensive, but it has a lot of common invasive plants. And then the pages, the facing pages, has a native that it might be confused with, for instance, American grape and porcelain berry. And it gives you very good field indicators of what to look for when you're trying to distinguish those plants. And the book that's above that, Bringing Nature Home, is a very readable book by Doug Tallamy out of the University of Delaware about why planting natives is important. And he really emphasizes the point I made earlier about the availability of caterpillars and other insects for breeding bird populations, and how the sort of ripple effect that has on a functional ecosystem. So that's what I have to share with you. And I'm, again, welcome for questions. And my very last slide has my email address if people wanted to ask me any other questions.
Yeah, so a few questions came in. So how do you suggest disposing of bittersweet vine?
I would bag it and put it out with trash, or I would burn it. So, I mean, some people live in an area where they can have springtime burn piles, and it would be a good way to dispose of it, is just to burn the darn stuff.
Okay. So then our next question is, how do you draw the line for permitting between a volunteer, sort of volunteer day project level 2, and sort of making the statement that volunteers can really move through invasive plants when motivated? I would love to have some sort of standard in our town where you can meet a certain requirement. You have more of an administrative approval than a formal RDA or an NOI.
I think that depends on the setting. If the work that you're doing is not in a wetland, then you don't need to communicate with them at all. If you're in a bordering vegetated wetland, then it would make sense to have a conversation with the commission to just inform the commission of what your plan is and see what kind of involvement they want to have with you about it. Okay. And then you would pass that information on when you're working with your volunteers, and it's an opportunity to educate folks too about the issue of wetlands protection and so forth, about what the scope of the work is and what's allowed where, and so forth.
Okay. So someone had asked if we're recording this and can make the slides available. We are recording this, and we will post it on our website, on the Middlesex Conservation District website, for people to review. And so another question came in: any information on an invasive celandine? Yep.
That's a plant that actually can, unless it's a giant infestation, can be handily. God, I just can't stop making puns tonight. I'm very sorry. It lends itself to hand pulling, and when you get a hold of the plant, you can rip it out pretty easily. And greater celandine can become like any invasive, can make a pretty monoculture if it's left tended to. It's also, you can also treat it with herbicides, but as I say, if it's not a big infestation, I would suggest hand pulling it and just bagging it, getting rid of it, you know, putting it out to trash or baking it in the sun.
Okay. Another question that came in, are regulations the same for watersheds as they are for wetlands?
That's a complicated question. Watershed lands are not, let's see, a lot of the land that's in a watershed is not technically, it's not a wetland, it's upland. But a lot of watershed managers don't allow any use of herbicides on their property at all. For instance, the Quabbin watershed doesn't allow use of any herbicides at all in any of its lands. I don't even think you're allowed to have dogs there, perhaps because of dog poop issues. So you would need to find out who is in charge of the land in question and find out what the regulations are for that particular property. Because most, as I say, I'd say the majority of land in a watershed is not a wetland.
Okay. Next question that came is, can you talk a little bit about glossy buckthorn and how to control it?
That one's a bear. It's similar to, I guess I would compare it to controlling any of the other woody shrubs, in that you would want to hand pull the smaller plants and the seedlings. With the very large plants, you would need to cut them and haul off the woody debris, hopefully cut it before it fruits. You can try to use those buckthorn baggies on very large mature glossy buckthorns. You can cut stem treat them. Repeated cutting of a large glossy buckthorn shrub is only going to cause it to stump sprout. So you do need to do something with it. It's a tricky one because it often likes to grow in wetter settings. And those are the kinds of settings that there's a lot of regulations about, justifiably so, and also just public concern about using herbicides in those settings. In some places, you're simply not allowed to. So you're kind of left with hand pulling in that context. But that's one of those plants, like, very clearly shows, once you identify it, that it has this capacity to flower and fruit all through the growing season until frost.
Okay. So another question that's come in is, I assume this is from someone who farms. Bindweed is a pretty big problem at the edge of their fields. I'm not sure if it's relevant to this talk, but was wondering if you had any suggestions about management. We've heard we can just dig it up, but it sounds like their property is much bigger, so that's not really a scalable solution. Yeah,
I'm sorry, I don't have any comment on bindweed other than that I know it's a big problem. It gums up harvesting equipment and is pretty much of a drag. I'm sorry, it's not in my skill set.
So the next question that came in is, how effective is solarizing covering in black plastic?
Well, it depends on the species. As I said before, solarizing knotweed has very mixed results because of the extensive root system they have. It will kill plants over time. The problem with solarizing is you're also killing all the microorganisms in the soil. So if you're going to solarize a piece of earth, you need to be prepared to restore that soil after you're done with that process, because not only have you baked your target species, you baked everything else. And that will impede your restoration efforts, because the soil doesn't have, the soil structure and function has been damaged by the solarization process. So it's something that needs to be undertaken with some careful thought about what to do after the solarization process is completed.
Mm-hmm. If someone was to solarize a large area, would they then put it maybe under cover crop for a while? And what cover crop would you suggest?
I would imagine you would want to use a cover crop that, like something that's a legume that's going to restore some, for instance, nitrogen to the soil. And you may need to amend it with compost, biochar. I'm not sure what would be usefully distributed on a very large piece of solarized soil. You also, when you solarize soil, you're also going to end up with a lot of plastic trash, which needs to be dealt with as well. And if it stays in the soil too long, it starts to disintegrate and become incorporated into the soil, which is something to think about. You have to do a cost benefit analysis of your project and figure out what what the end goal of your project is.
Okay, let's see. I think we've got one more question that's come in. So, wine berries, are they invasive?
I think wineberry it may be, I think it might be either on the Massachusetts list of invasives, or it is heading onto it. I can't say for certain, but I think it is a problematic plant. That's a good question. I should look up wineberry. I'm going to make a note to myself to do that. Note to self-made. Okay, thanks for that one.
So we'll just give another minute for questions to filter in. And then while we're waiting, I'll just ask a question that I sometimes think about. So we have made an effort. I'm sorry, my husband has made an effort, not me, to control the invasives. And there our property abuts about 40 acres, and there's a lot of invasives, on that section. So what can we do to try to make sure that they're not continuously sort of like hopping over? Is there anything that we can do? Or is that just sort of like the way it is?
It's analogous to flossing your teeth. You just have to keep after it. I live on a 4-acre piece of land here, and I cruise through it periodically. And just the other day, I was in a very remote corner of my massive estate here and discovered some garlic mustard that I didn't know was there. Just by happening to be someplace I don't usually go. So mainly you have to just keep an eye on it and monitor it and pull the seedlings, because you're not going to be able to prevent spread. Even if that 40 acres didn't have invasives, you can't eliminate invasive seeds coming into your property anyways, because they come in with birds or deer or rabbits or whatever. But basically it sort of has to become part of your management strategy for your property. Along, like you mow your lawn, you check your invasives.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So we'll just give another minute for any questions to come in.
I think that's a really important point, Joan, that people, I think, have this idea that they eradicate their invasives and they're good to go. I think we need to acknowledge with climate change and just with the influence of the environment around your property, you're always going to have new plants and probably other animals as well coming through your property.
Yeah.
So it's an ongoing task. It's not I'm going to accomplish this and be done. And that's really part of the cost benefit trade-off when you're thinking about the method that you're going to use. It's not like if you go to a more intensive method, you may move faster, but you're not going to finish.
Correct.
None of us are ever going to be finished with this task.
That's absolutely true.
So as you're evaluating your methods and the approach you want to take and the groups you want to put together on your property, it's just better to come to terms with that sooner rather than later, I guess.
Yeah, because that's a very good point. Eradication is not feasible. Even if you got rid of every single plant on your property, there's still birds and wind and whatnot that's going to possibly reestablish some invasives on your land. I have no idea where the garlic mustard came from. Just showed up. I was not pleased.
Excellent. So we have no further questions coming in at this time.
So my contact information there for people if anyone wants to get in touch.
Thank you so much, Joan. The one thing I would say about the garlic mustard is if you eat it early, it's yummy.
I've heard that it makes a nice salad.
It makes good salad. So there, if you want to approach it that way, harvest it quickly in the spring and add it to your salad. It's a 2-for-1.
People eat, they eat Japanese knotweed shoots.
Yeah.
In
I've
all
heard
manner.
that. I haven't brought myself to try those.
Yeah, it's a little slimy, but it's supposedly similar to rhubarb.
Okay.
And you can make fruit leathers out of the autumn olive berries. So there's things you can do. If you can't beat them, eat them.
Exactly. If you can do it with invasive animal species, we can do it with plant species too.
A salad of garlic mustard with some feral pig.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and Joan for this very intensive introduction and comprehensive management plan for so many of our plants.
The person who had asked earlier about lists or information about a broader selection of invasives, if they want to email me, I can get them some resources that might be of use to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those who don't have my email address, I'm going to try to, under pressure, carefully type out my very long email address here for people. Amy at Middlesex Conservation @gmail.com, and people can email me, and I can put you in touch with Joan. And Susan and Joan and I will just sort of hang out here for a few minutes. And if anyone wants to stay for a moment, we're available for a quick chat. Other than that, thank you everyone for coming. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Thanks
you
for the
very much,
opportunity
Joan.
to chat with y'all.